Hi, this is Marjohn Love, and this is Marjohn's Musings. And today's show is a kind of deep show. I've been listening on my Kindle to an audiobook that was deeply disturbing. It was also a very difficult listen. Have you ever heard the expression exhaustively researched or researched exhaustively? Well, Gary Taubes wrote a book called The Case Against Sugar, and that's what it is. It's written sort of the way a lawyer thinks. And he does a historical retrospective all the way back to the ancient Greeks, talking about the development and spread of sweeteners. And the two that he's very, very worried about are sucrose, which is the form of sugar that we buy in these 4-pound cans, or 5-pound bags, the white crystalline sugar. But it's also the light brown sugar, the dark brown sugar, and molasses. Those all come from sugar cane. Sugar cane has its own history. And I think for me, that was part of my dilemma with the audiobook. I purchased the Cliff Notes version of A Case Against Sugar. And although I think the people tried really hard to condense many, many hours into just a few, they also lost the gist of the book a little bit. I wanted to recommend the Cliff Notes version because he uses words like lipogenesis. And if you've never taken biochemistry, then you probably don't know what lipogenesis is. It's a very important word. Think the Bible, Genesis, in the beginning, the beginning. And lipo means fat. So lipogenesis is fat formation, the forming of fat. And Gary Taubes makes a very convincing case that sugars, all sugars, but especially sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, cause the development of fat, which is something that I've been plagued with since I was told my son Andrew was twins. I ate for 3. I delivered 1 very chubby baby, and I suddenly, for the first time in my life, had a weight problem. So I dieted off the weight, which was bad for breastfeeding. Breast milk, by the way, is sweet. And the author talks about how we are hardwired, genetically hardwired, to taste sweet and think, oh, mother's milk, or fresh, ripe fruit. And that when we taste bitter, typically we're alarmed. If you give babies something bitter, even newborns, they'll spit it out. Whereas if you give newborn infants sugared water, they prefer the sugared water to their own mother's milk. I found that idea deeply disturbing. I know they gave sugar water to my Andrew when he was brand new. Suffice it to say that over the years, I have undertaken many, many diets, but 7 really serious attempts at losing weight. And the reason that I brought this up today and that I'm doing the show about sugar today is as of this morning, I have lost 36 pounds. Now, that's not that unusual for me. I one time lost 79 pounds. My terror is that I tend to gain the weight right back plus more. And the modern wisdom is diets don't work. It's not a diet, it's a lifestyle, which basically translates to if you do a regime that works, you're stuck on it for the rest of your life. Not everybody can do that. And then doctors get angry with patients and they say that they are yo-yo dieting, that it's very bad for your heart, it's not good for your blood pressure, it's real rough on your skin, you wind up with crepey skin and stuff. But I don't know very many people who, when surrounded by sweet and savory and unctuous and delicious foods, can be perfectly good all the time. Gary Taubes talks about the history of nutrition, the science of nutrition, and how, unlike other sciences, nutrition, which kind of grew out of medicine, lauded and respected its heroes so much that it was rude or perceived incompetent to question authorities in the field. And he talks about how when people wanted to make a case against smoking tobacco cigarettes, it was easier to do because you could look at non-smokers who had never smoked and heavy smokers who had smoked a lot over a long period of years. And the heavy smokers had 20 to 30 times the risk of lung cancer as non-smokers, in which the disease of lung cancer was extremely, extremely rare. But that you couldn't make that same type of research for sugar unless you went to the Inuit people or the Maasai in Africa or these small indigenous rural populations who had not experienced sugar, and that those studies were done in the 40s through the 60s, and with globalization, they can't find any other groups of people who have never ingested sugar. But the literature that he quotes states that when Europeans encountered these native peoples for the first time, they were lean. And they were lean whether they ate grains and fruits, or whether they were like the Maasai and their diet consisted of meat, milk, and blood. He also talked about the cultural bias against obesity and how people stated that to be obese is a calorie problem. You ingest more calories than you expend. And he found that argument distressing on a lot of levels. One of them was that obesity was blamed on gluttony, overeating, and sloth, two of the deadly sins, that you ate too much and you didn't do enough, and that was why you were fat. Well, I can get a witness from next door. I belonged to the Zone Fitness Club for years, and I worked out an hour and a half a day, 5 days a week, cross-training, aerobic 3 days and anaerobic 2 days. And I counted calories and I did the diets, and I went from 211 pounds to 182 pounds, and I got stuck there. I was not able to shift that no matter what I did. It was called a plateau, and you were just supposed to tough it out. And what I did was I restricted my calories further, and I worked out longer and harder, and I gave myself a rotator cuff tear and a pelvic abdominal injury from kicking 150 pounds, and I damaged my wrists because when you work out on workout equipment, you use your hands for nearly every exercise. So I decided I would add a walking program, which I did, and at 3 miles I was fine, but when I upped it to 5 miles precipitously, I blew out plantar fasciitis. Why do I mention that? I think people who hit a plateau in a weight loss program can get desperate. I know I even had suicidal ideation. I was so fat and I hated myself. It wasn't until about 2 years ago that I realized, maybe 3 years ago, that I realized I'm sugar addicted. In the book, Gary talks about how people were exposed to habit-forming substances: tea, coffee, rum, chocolate, tobacco. It got me thinking about addiction. Opioids and opioid-like substances have killed so many Americans. The statistics for 2018 aren't in yet, but for 2017, they're astounding. I was at the Peabody Essex Museum because they had a show about the Forbidden City. And instead of talking about the emperors, the show was about the empresses. I found it fascinating, and I also found it disturbing. You should go and see it. You will see more Chinese people in one place than anywhere else except like a Chinese cultural concert. There were so many people speaking Chinese at the PEM, looking very carefully at the exhibits. And they talked about the empresses and the dowager empresses. The Empress Dowager Chongqing, I hope I said that right, was nurturing a young boy that she wanted to become the next emperor. And because the child was young when picked, she got to be regent. She got to be sort of the ruler of the country behind the scenes. And I asked my husband, who's a bit of a historian, when were the Opium Wars? The British brought opium to China. And a man named Lin Zheyu made 1,600 arrests of people who in the US we would call pushers, dealers. And the British attacked the Chinese because they were making a great deal of money bringing it into China where it's sold, and they got very wealthy. So the first war was 1839, and it ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. And at that time, the British demanded 5 treaty ports: Shanghai, Canton, Foochow, Amoy, and Ningpo. And then they began importing opium through those ports. And the Empress would not tolerate the destruction of the Chinese culture that wrought. And so there was a second Opium War, 1856 through 1860. And the British took over the Pearl River, which is where the rice belt is in China, and basically starved the Chinese people into submission. And what they demanded at that treaty was the legalization of opium, and that there were to be no tariffs, and they weren't going to pay any taxes for any of their trade. And that the second time, all ports would be open to Britain. In 1906, 35,000 tons of opium entered China. There were 13,500 addicts. And Gary Taubes in the book poses a very thought-provoking question about people's tolerance of the kidnapping and enslavement of Black Africans to cut sugarcane and work in the hellhole refineries so that people could have sweeteners, sugar. He asks, what atrocities were our ancestors willing to commit in order to have their sweetness? I'm not so sure it's as simple as that. I think there's also a very important factor of financial gain. Kevin and I went to the Rockport Public Library last evening. We went to a series called Daring Democracy. The movie that we saw last night talked about the disenfranchisement right now, 2018, of African Americans and Latinos and people of Oriental descent, be that Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, people of Oriental descent. And the movie was done with a cartoony lightening of a very deep subject, and it kind of helped you sit through some of the ugly parts, like lynching. And it talked about the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King and how under President Obama, the voting rights bill that had been enacted into law was gutted. And it showed a whole media blitz about double voting and fake voting that was used as a reason for spreading these lists of double voters that turned out to be bogus. It was a lie. Some of the things that distressed me was they talked about absentee ballots. Well, every soldier, sailor, and Marine on deployment has to use an absentee ballot, and how most of them are never counted. And it showed lines of black people at the one and only voting place open to them, standing in line for hours and hours, and then being given an application for voter registration mail-in ballot, and those wouldn't be counted either. And it showed factories where the jobs have gone to China, and the people of color who used to work in the factories and had these very modest homes were having their homes foreclosed. That house is empty, that house is empty, that house is empty, that house is empty. I'm losing my house. It was upsetting. It was deeply upsetting. But there was a media blitz during the development of sugar consumption against black people. It was the way rich white people could justify kidnapping and enslaving people by saying they were an inferior hominid. They were not fully human, which is why even to this day, we torture monkeys and the great apes in research that we don't perform on people. And I thought of the Chinese. You know, Richard Milhous Nixon opened mainland China to trade. For years, we traded with Hong Kong, which was won in the Opium Wars, so that Britain got a piece of the action for any trade with anybody from China, because the Allies supported the financial sanctions on China. One of the high points was that President Thomas Jefferson, in revolutionary times, proposed that people use maple sugar rather than sucrose, because maple sugar could be collected by women. The white settlers learned how to harvest sugar from maple trees. And I brought you in my bottle of 100% pure maple syrup from Canada. But in thinking about lipogenesis and the fact that sugar causes you to release insulin, and insulin causes you to store fat. This pretty little book about the gathering of sugar and how the sugar was made on an outing in Canada. If you look at the photographs, the people are heavyset. They're not slender. One of the conundrums for the government in the United States when people came forward and said, sugar causes dental caries, cavities in your teeth. And this is before modern dentistry with, gold fillings. I have like gold crowns. I had so many cavities, they had to grind my teeth and my cavity away and put crowns on. And because it's a case, like a legal case against sugar, Gary name drops. And he talks about physicians trying to get a handle on diabetes. I think our first text where we look at diabetes is the story of the little girl and Lazarus who are raised from the dead. In the 1950s, when people understood coma because there'd been a horrible influenza that led to encephalitis, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people wound up in a vegetative coma. And those that were allowed to perish died, but those that were nursed carefully lived. And in the 50s, after being in coma for years, all of a sudden, quite a few of them woke up. Maybe the infectious agent that caused the coma hit its lifespan and died. And these people woke up, and it was big news for my grandmother and my auntie and my mom and my grandpa that people who had been in coma for years suddenly woke up. And it became something that entered the popular consciousness, the concept of coma. Well, my mother was an insulin-dependent diabetic. And I saw her in coma. As a matter of fact, she was pronounced dead on a Friday. And when the mortician came in to get the body on Monday morning from the vault, he did a quick check. She was in atrial fibrillation. She was brought back up to the ward, and they resuscitated her, and she lived another 10 years. People thought that that was what happened to Lazarus, and that was what happened to the little girl in the Bible. So, without having a diagnosis of diabetes, we do have two rather provocative stories about people who looked dead and then were revived. And in the Middle Ages, people got so crazy about being buried alive that they put bells with strings into the coffin, and the Egyptians buried their people with food and water in a signaling mechanism so that if they woke up and they weren't really dead, they could call for help and get out. Now, that was only for the pharaohs, the ruling class, like the empresses, who were basically concubines in the Forbidden City. Why do I mention the concubine thing? Well, I was thinking about propaganda and media blitzes. I mean, if you can convince a bunch of white people that Black people from Africa are basically monkeys. They're apes. They're not really people. And believe it or not, that actually was a strategy that was employed. You can teach people to believe anything. Well, what was my generation taught to believe? Well, one of the cartoons I used to watch was Pepe Le Pew and Penelope Pussycat. And Pepe had a Jones for Penelope, but Pepe was a skunk, which was a diss on French people. You know, I'm part French. Pepe Le Pew spoke with a fake French accent. But it was also a Me Too situation. If you look at my plate, Penelope is pushing and clawing like, get off me, I don't like you. French men are not particularly sexually aggressive more than any other nationality of men. But the fact that a bunch of little boys saw that Pepe did not give up and he grabbed and groped Penelope, why are men in their 50s and 60s being accused of impropriety in heterosexual situations? They were taught, don't take no for an answer, not just by this one cartoon, but all over the place. And they were also taught male privilege. I know quite a few women who left the church because of the patriarchy. And, you know, Eve sinned against God, and then she duped Adam into eating the apple of the knowledge of good and evil. And apples didn't exist until they were hybridized in England from crab apples and rose hips. But let's not get too technical. Anyway, a lot of people get aggravated about the Eve story because it makes Eve the villain, and anybody who had the Bible as their text subjugated women because of that. Well, the empresses in China didn't follow the Bible, and neither did the emperors. And yet, right there in the display, women shall not be allowed to rule. And who made that law and why? The reality is, in ancient history, there were matriarchs. You know, there's famous Venus statues of women rulers. They tended to rule in agrarian societies. So sugar, the case against sugar. Gary Taubes talks about the two types of diabetes. Type 1, which shows up in children and will kill them if it's not treated. And type 2, fat in 40s, you know, and then you get type 2 diabetes. And how the disease was exceedingly rare until the introduction of sugar, and that as the consumption of sugar grew, the incidences of diabetes grew with it. And the more sugar we ate, the more diabetes we had, the more obesity we had, the more heart disease we had, the more hypertension we had, the more cancer we had. When he got into the cancer, I got aggravated. I took the Kindle and I darn near pitched it up against the wall. I got 6 people in my life fighting cancer. And, you know, thinking that sugar might be implicated in the gout and rheumatoid arthritis, that sort of made kind of sense. But cancer, I got aggravated. And then being who I am, I went back a day later, plugged it back in, rewound a little bit and listened to the argument. It was stunning. I was like, oh my God. And then Gary talks about the key players in the sugar industry not allowing research that linked diabetes to sugar consumption and linked sugar consumption to heart disease to be taken with any credulity. He talks about the sugaring of children's morning breakfast cereal and the betrayal of Kellogg, who was a Seventh-day Adventist and very much into healthy nutrition, by his own brother so that they could have a bigger market share of the children's cereal market. In 1978, a statistician, Kelly West, who was trained in epidemiology, the study of the vectors of disease, where do diseases come from? She said that in 1978, diabetes killed more people than all wars combined. In China, diabetes was unknown in 1900. And then it was recorded 2 patients in 12,000. Now, 11.6% of the population, 1 in every 9 people in China, is diabetic. 110 million people. Over the years, I was diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. My blood sugars were okay, but I had symptoms that were insulin resistant. And in the book, Gary talks about why doctors thought obesity caused diabetes. Because it takes 20 years of sugar consumption before diabetes develops, and you have to eat quite a bit of sugar for diabetes to develop. And he wasn't able to establish what was a safe amount of sugar. So doctors thought that fat people got diabetes. But 1 in 10 diabetics are neither obese nor overweight. They're diabetic, but they're not fat. And he goes into great detail, implicating both Harvard and MIT, for having researchers who took money from sugar foundation people to fund research into sugar to show that sugar was safe. And we've all heard the reason you're fat is you eat too much, and what you eat is making you fat, especially fats. And then they did research on that, and they found out that fat in the diet actually mediated diabetes. My mom weighed 104 pounds. She was insulin-dependent diabetic. And then he talks about the multi-generational effects of sugar and how babies exposed to high glucose in the blood of the mother develop more insulin-producing cells in their pancreas as an infant. It's sort of like a biological safeguard so that when the baby's born, it can eat what food is available to the mother. I was in a fascinating discussion when we were in Amsterdam at an Eat With Me dinner with a man who was researching apnea and found out information that I haven't corroborated, but that indicated that pregnant women who smoked or were exposed to quite a bit of secondhand smoke got carbon monoxide in their blood, and that their children had a really higher rate of apnea. The idea that disease vectors could be multi-generational, and that parents who develop diabetes in their 50s are likely to have children who are obese and develop diabetes. It was just like mind-boggling. And that diabetes exploded in England when people tasted tea from China, found it bitter. So like a baby, ew, this is bitter, let's spit it out. Plah. And then somebody said, well, why don't you put sugar in it? And they did. And tea became a national obsession in England. Tea time, they're famous for it. And that their diabetes exploded. They had diabetes all the way back to the kings, Henry II and whatever. They had sugar in their food, but diabetes didn't appear as a scourge until common people started putting a spoon of sugar in their tea. And then there was sugar in baking, scones and biscuits and cakes and cookies. He does a whole thing on the French and jellies, jams, and chocolates. In the New World, chocolate was taken with chili. It was a hot beverage taken with chili pepper. And the Spanish didn't like it, but since they discovered it, they sent some back to the Emperor of Spain. But since they also sent back sugar, they put the two of them together and came up with hot cocoa. What child has not had hot cocoa? And this battle about sugar, it's been going on for over a century. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, got caught up in legal battles between the sugar lobbyists and the people who produced non-caloric sweeteners from coal tar, saccharin, and later NutraSweet and Splenda and all that stuff, the non-caloric sweeteners. The sugar industry wanted to make them illegal. And the FDA got all caught up in this, and to sort out what they were doing, they used research, which turned out to be funded by the sugar industry. In 1974, doctors believed sugar caused diabetes. And I've talked to you before about Robert Lustig. He's an endocrinologist, a pediatric endocrinologist, who was investigating gross obesity in newborns. Why were these tiny infants becoming grossly obese? And on a video that you can see on YouTube and on the channel from the University of California, San Francisco, he holds up cans of infant formula, and between these two cans, there's 43 types of sugar. Glucose, maltose, dextrose, lactose, galactose. He says in a movie There are so many names for sugar, you don't know them all. Now we have an epidemic of fatty liver and Alzheimer's disease, and some of the dementias have been called diabetes type 3. So Lustig is quoted in the case against sugar. We must show these sugars and those who sell them for what they are. And the book reminds us of Occam's razor. Isaac Newton paraphrases it. Admit no more causes than are true and sufficient to explain the appearance of phenomena. I took pages and pages of notes. And then I realized there was no way that I could winnow this very important subject down to just 55 minutes. But I want to leave you with a takeaway. Weight Watchers taught me to read labels for calories and fat. Well, since I read labels, it was easy to drop down to sugar. Do that for yourself. When you're going to buy a product, look at the sugar content. If the sugar is high, don't buy the product. Try to trade in your soft drinks for a non-sweetened soft drink. And the reason that I say that, I have here sweet leaf stevia drops. And my doctor said, I really don't want you to start using a lot of artificial sweeteners. Not because they'll hurt you, but because they make you crave sugar. But I thought about it a little differently. The Almighty made a laboratory in your mouth. You taste sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and savory. Umami, the Japanese call it. If you put an artificial sweetener in anything and then you taste sweet, your pancreas will release insulin. And perhaps that's why dieters have a higher proportion of insulin resistance, because if there isn't sugar in your blood because you used a non-calorie sweetener, there's no sugar to turn into fat, and your body says, wait a minute, we got insulin rolling around here, this isn't good. There's no sugar to be metabolized. Just a thought. We've got 3 minutes. Honey, bee barf. I love it. But the Native American people did not know honey. And when the white settlers came, they brought honeybees with them. And Native Americans called them the white man's fly. I have a Thai cooking book, and because I went to the Chinese exhibit, I got myself a Chinese cooking book. Problem: in order for me at my age to read this thing, I need my eyeglasses. It's like, whoa. And that brings me to my last point. Why did I do everything in my power to give up sugar and consequently, without a whole lot of effort except swimming 3 times a week for less than an hour, lose 35 pounds. I popped both vitruses off my eyes. I'm at the beginning stages of diabetic retinopathy, which causes blindness. I love my eyes. I'm an artist. I'm a craftsperson. I love natural beauty. I don't want to go blind. For me, the vitreous coming off my eyes was sort of like the smoker when the radiologist shows them a shadow on their lungs. And after 20 years of not being able to quit cigarettes, they finally quit smoking. But sugar's hard. It's in everything. Don't be afraid of natural sugar in fruit and in milk and in grains, some of them. Be afraid of added sugar. You might be able to cut your sugar carefully, and when you want something sweet, eat a piece of fruit. That's all for now. This is Marjohn, and this has been Marjohn's Musings.